Hey, Composing Gloves here, and today we're going to be checking out a beat, choosing sounds for a beat. So, something when you sit down to write a beat or write a song or something, the very first thing you're going to have to confront is what kind of sounds am I trying to go for? What emotion, what feel? And one day I'm going to do a whole series on beat making because depending on the level of beat, you can pound a beat out pretty darn fast if you understand what you're going for. So this particular beat, I had a very specific thing in mind, and I knew that the bass instrument I wanted to use was a harpsichord, and it sounds like this. So I had this sound, and I was like, wow, this is a pretty groovy sound. And I wanted the harpsichord specifically because I was going to write a line that sounded like this. And I just had this in my head, and I was like, man, this would be really cool with a harpsichord because it's sort of like this aggressive attack, and then it releases pretty quick. So I was like, this is the type of sound I want. So harpsichord. If you know the instruments and you know where you can get that in your own library, then you can go ahead and do that. This isn't something that I was like, I'm going to go and synthesize a bunch of stuff. I was like, heck no, I'm just going to grab a harpsichord. So I grabbed a harpsichord and wrote out a line. And then I needed to complement it, right? I needed some themes and all this other songwriting stuff, but then I need another sound. And this sound, I wanted it to be in contrast to the harpsichord. So I decided to bring in a bass. I actually used, I believe, 2 basses in this beat. But if we go ahead and play it, okay, cool. So we see we get a little jam going here. And on the bass, on the note of the bass, I use Kontakt a lot of the time when I'm doing stuff sort of like this. And for this bass, I wanted a bassy bass. And the basses, each bass tends to have its own feeling, and it's really important that you explore your sound. So when I bought Komplete a long time ago, I had no idea that I was buying like things that I would spend years learning how to use, simply because there's so much that you can use them for. Like I'm getting Reaktor now, and I've had that for ages. So here I've gone through quite a number of these libraries and just simply messed with presets. I mean, you can spend hours doing it. And I could talk about all sorts of sort of nifty ways to go about learning your sounds, just going through and making tracks with them, trying to get a comprehensive view of what each one does, finding ways deliberately to use them. That might not usually be done. But I really like the bass in the Cuba setting. So if you go to the Cuba or the Cuba library, so you go to Cuba, instruments, and the melodic instruments, and you'll see bass in there. And this thing just sounds cool. Like I always liked the sound of this thing. So I decided to grab that, and I had that in mind. I didn't think a sub bass, a sine wave bass. I have one in here on my template by default. And you see, I used a filter to create this particular one. And that'd be fine for some other styles of beats, but not so fine for this style of beat. So I decided, I'm not going to go for that. So I went for that one, and then I had to develop it. So I wanted a drum loop. And for the drum loop, there's several ways you could go about this. You could try and make your own drum loop and be all cool and realistic. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to use a beat that was a live beat. So it sounded like, it was a real drummer. So I grabbed the Sly 6, and I have a whole series on Sly 6 in the FL12 effects series, even though it's technically a generator. And I grabbed this beat, sounds like this. If I were to select everything and turn on keyboard input. And I thought, that's a pretty cool beat. I can make something cool out of that. So I took it, put it in there, sliced it up, and then I made this out of it, right? And I knew that this is like kind of an unusual way of doing things, but I kind of like the vibe it was giving me. So I went ahead and selected that as my sound. So these sort of things when all these things started coming together like this, I began to establish my mood. And so I had my mood going, and so we reached this point. And I'm using that like at the beginning, it's a new idea. And if you look it up online, a lot of people talk about this really interesting idea is the predictability of music versus the, unpredictability of music. How the randomness of music is kind of what intrigues us, by the fact that we're able to predict. And when those predictions are met, we're like, good. But if they're met so often that we know it's going to happen the entire time, that's not so good, except for if you're doing it deliberately. Then it's sort of like a trick on you. It gets really weird. But basically, this line here, I've given you something that you can easily predict, but I'm using other things to make it interesting as we go. And so even though it's predictable, what I've done is I've extended the realm of creative freedom. So after I've established this little groove section and I put a mid drum loop here, I keep the notes the same and I just let them run a little bit because I need to get you in that mindset. So when you listen to something and you're like, it needs to happen one more time for me to feel satisfied. Like, it's one of those things. So it happens, and then I introduce the solo. So if I let it keep going like that, it might be a bit boring. And parts of this I deliberately have is a little repetitive because I intend to use this as background music. So this is not intended to be a beat specifically for listening. But as we go here, I wanted to vary it up a little bit more, so I introduce a solo. So I write in a solo here. I actually jammed out on the piano, and I didn't really like anything that I jammed out on, but I took elements that I did like and sort of pieced them together. And then I reached this really nice transition, but the sound is still the harpsichord. So I'm not using like a ton of sounds here. I'm using very few sounds, but if we let it jam into this, you'll see what I mean. We have our sounds here. We've picked them out, established a mood, and so you see at this point, we're like grooving. I am really happy with this moment right here. Like, that moment to me is a really cool moment. These are the moments that I endeavor to make where I'm like, man, that was freaking smooth. That was nice. Maybe you don't like it. Maybe it's against your taste, but I quite liked it. So what happens here is, instead of adding more sounds, which I do add an entirely new drum loop. And in this case, I really liked the drum loop. So I was like, that's a cool sounding drum loop. So I just ran with that right there. I was like, that's great. So it was along the vibe I wanted, and it varied up the drums from before. And I even combined the two later on. Actually, I think it's like the next bar. Yeah, see, so sometimes you can mix them. We'll look at that more in a sec. But you see here, I didn't add like a whole bunch of new sounds right there besides the drum loop. Instead, I took what I already had. So I'm doing the solo thing, and I'm like, okay, this is like kind of random and like, whoa, what's going on? Like, it's a bit intriguing, but you don't want to get too crazy on it. I could keep going. There are ways to develop it in a controlled manner, or in a pleasing manner, I should say, one that I would enjoy. But instead, I decided to take it in and add these new rhythms. You can notice which ones are part of it because they are louder down here. I've emphasized them. And so it feels like the soloist went down into that range. Like there's like two harpsichords or something. And so it's like, I think it's pretty groovy. We get a new drum loop, and we're concluding an idea right here. So it creates this transition for me that's really nice. And then I actually take the drum loop here and I combine it with the first drum loop. And sometimes this just doesn't work. It's not a great thing. But in this case, the way I wrote out the rhythms, it happened to line up in a way that was, I thought, very pleasing and created a sense of additional movement, even though it's the same thing. So I think that's pretty cool. You can hear it layered in. And it should also be noted, this top one is not a very prominent drum loop. Like, it's not as loud or as aggressive as this one is. So it serves quite nicely as just a backbone, emphasizing parts of this that I thought worked out pretty well. And so after that, we went ahead, I repeated the section. So you see it's 10-10. I decided to keep it the same. We're not going to do anything crazy. And then I wanted to add in a new element and remove an element. So I wanted to vary it up. And so to do this, I added in some strings and I doubled the bass. Actually, I think I doubled the bass here. No, I didn't double the bass here. So another transition. This one's a little more abrupt, but it's the feeling I wanted. And here I add in another bass. So let me play for you the Cuba bass. So the Cuba bass sounds like this, right? And that's really nice. But I wanted something that had a little more aggressiveness to it. And this is a sound library I go to all the time. I went for the Solo Strings double bass. Solo Strings. It's in the solo section, double bass solo of the Kontakt Factory library. So Factory library ensemble. You should have this if you have Kontakt. So I really like that. When you play low notes. Oh yeah, that's cool. So I knew that this would meld well with the top layer. And so when I combine them, if I were to solo these, and so I was like, oh yeah, that's gonna groove. I like that. So what I did was I took these, and I have like stuff going on in the mixer, like reverb, compression, stuff like that, but nothing really all that crazy. I leave the sounds pretty much as they are, just make them fit together a little bit, just mixing stuff. And so at this transition, I really groove in, and I keep the groove going, and I drop this out and bring it back in sort of periodically. And I bring in the new sound of the strings, which is also along the vibe I want. Now the strings, I wanted a really specific type of string, and I ended up sort of finding something else along the way. Sometimes that just happens. So I use the animator capabilities of Session Strings Pro, and I just really like how this sounds. Getting a good groove can be a little challenging sometimes, but it's actually a 3/4 rhythm. So I settled on that as a sound and had it go through some of the chords with some voicings I thought were pleasing. And it sounds like this once we put it all together. So right here, that's an important moment. So you can see here, this is grooving, and you can feel that I've shifted where things apply in the beat because I've added that second bass. So when the bass jumps out, especially near the end of the phrase, dun, 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 it's like, whoa, that like came out. Things are like moving and folding. And those are the sorts of moments that I really like, where it's like, it feels like it's like a wave of sound, but there are bits and pieces that are clearly defined and pop out in moments that make musical sense. So to me, this is sort of a cool moment. And as we come in here, you see I drop things out because I'm like, hey, I gotta let something go. Because when I was brand new, I used to just get more and more complicated, and then I'd get stuck. Like you get all the stuff going, and you're like, what do I do now? It jams, but when I add more, it starts to be detrimental. Like there's too much going on. So in this case, I removed the backbone piece. If anything, that's the most heard thing. And so removing it creates a lot of room, like a ton of room. I could do a number of things here. If I wanted to go for a larger expansion on the piece, I could change chord structures, slowly morph into other instruments, and try and introduce a new theme, and maybe make more of a theme out of a part of the solo here, or maybe the rhythm that I introduce here. But I wanted to just continue moving on, so I don't select any new sounds. At this point, I pretty much have all the sounds I'm going to use, and I've decided that the arrangement is going to move towards an outro at this point. So one of the things I need to get rid of is this drum beat. I do bring it back at the end just as a structural thing. It makes a little more sense. So as I play it, so, and when in context, it makes a little more sense than by itself. But another thing that you probably might consider doing. So this is like background music, right? So I'm not too concerned about things being super variable. But I could come in here and to make the beat a little smoother. Instead of writing out this transition here, I consider it a little clunky right now. And so what I could do is I could come in here and write out a new chord structure that will emphasize a change. Instead of having new sounds come in, I would write out new notes that would indicate, oh, we're changing, we're transitioning here, and it would happen. And I did this on my Facebook page. By the way, this beat's played through on my Facebook page if you want to go see a playthrough of it. And I have several other beats. I tend to post playthroughs there of the short little things because this is just like something I did in like an hour, maybe less. I don't know. I did it pretty quick though. And so I'm just saying you would consider writing out different notes. That's also sort of the tale that you have a good song or a good jam or a good something when new sounds aren't necessarily necessary. You just need to change the notes. And so, yeah, so this is a little lazy on my part. But hey, you know, we all have those moments. So we go through here, we introduce the main theme again, we get jamming. And do I use pattern 11? No, pattern 11 is new. What do I do in pattern 11? Ah, I see. Okay, so this is a recap. Recap moment. It's funny because I just wrote this. I can't remember what I did. Recap moment. I bring everything back together, and then I move towards the outro. So this is sort of like a mini bridge or something. And so we move into here, jams out a little bit, lets you sort of live up the moment of all the pieces. And moments like this can be important and satisfying. Well, you're going for satisfying here, but they're important because they give the listener a chance to explore the sonic textures you've established and the ideas you've created. They can listen out into different areas of your beat. Granted, this isn't the thickest layer of ideas, but it is something that does have a nice feel to it, and you kind of want to explore the different pieces that are moving around, and it's interesting to try and feel everything happening at the same time. So that's one of the things that's sort of important. Well, it's really important when writing a beat. And then we come to our final piece. And I like endings like that. Sometimes they don't jive as well, but I really do like that ending. So usually endings are pretty easy for me to figure out. Sometimes I have a hard time figuring out an ending, and that's usually because I'm not sure if I want to continue the piece or not. And that can mean a number of things in the creative process. Usually it's not a good sign. If you can't figure out how you want to end it, then you probably didn't state things very clearly over here. Like you're unsure what to do, but sometimes it's not a bad thing. It's not always a bad thing. Sometimes you just don't know how you want to deal with things. So yeah, but usually you might want to examine what's going on over here if you're a little confused about how to end it. In my experience, that's what I found to be the case the majority of the time. But anyways, those are the sounds I selected. So you'd be interesting if you want to know, is what I meant to say. Over here, this is the harpsichord. It's in the Kontakt Factory library. It's in the orchestral section of it, I believe. I can't remember where it's at. Under keyboards. Just dig through there. You'll find it. The Giant there's a piano in there, which I don't believe I used ever. You see there's piano here, something I loaded up and just never used. So I believe I started jamming on the piano, and then I moved to write it in the harpsichord because I didn't like the sound the piano was giving me. So that's going to happen to you. I was like, this isn't fitting in the beat the way I wanted to. This is what I jammed out on. And then I was like, nah. So I went into the harpsichord and wrote out those extra lines. Then the bass, of course, we've already talked about the bass and the strings. So that's the sounds. That's what I selected. And you'd be surprised to find that you can do quite a lot with very few sounds. It's not always required that you design all your sounds or have these incredible, I don't know, tons and tons of sounds. It's nice to say simple sometimes. So yes, another tip that I've noticed, I like to keep my Kontakt. It's a pain in the butt waiting for Kontakt to open like that. So I usually keep my Kontakt. I want to keep it open like this, because if you minimize it like this by double clicking, it's got to take the time to reload everything. And the more stuff you have going, the longer this can take. So I tend to, if I click around places, I'll leave it open, and I'll hold down Alt when I'm opening up plugins so that I don't close Kontakt. And then I'll either click down here, or if Kontakt is still depressed, you know that it's still open. So you can cycle through your windows hitting tab. And I will so do this over looking for it. Plus, having extra windows open is bad for your processing. So for example, you may have forgotten to close something in your Maybe you forgot to close the transient master or whatever, and you hit tab and you notice this plugin pops up and you're like, what the heck? I'm done with this thing. Close it. Don't leave it open. It will eat processing and just your computer will suffer performance hit. Maybe it's not a big deal in your particular project, but just so you know, if you have any questions, let me know. Subscribe and have a blessed day.